The 1970s was a time when the British car industry led the way in terms of design and engineering excellence, but that pioneering spirit was often undermined by circumstances beyond its control. We brought two examples of that trailblazing decade, the Leyland Princess from 1975 and the Rover SD1 from 1976, to see what they're like today, almost 50 years on from when they were first introduced.
So which one are we starting then?
I don't know, Joe, what do you think?
Well, the Princess came out first, and I want to drive it, and I'm editing this, so we're starting the Princess.
Fair enough, let's start with that.
Let's hit the road. But first, our friends at Lancaster Insurance are running monthly giveaways. You can win all sorts, from experience days to tools, restaurant vouchers and tech. So click the link below at the end of the video to enter their latest competition. Well, I'll tell you what, Phil, today I feel like a princess. No, sorry, feel like I'm in a princess. And I'm really rather liking it already. Obviously, it replaced the Land Crab, which we've touched on the Land Crab before, go and watch that video if you haven't. And that had all the good ideas behind it, but sadly the execution was a bit lacking. The Princess was an aim to right those wrongs, wasn't it? A similar principle, but more modern, more up to date, do better what they failed at the first time around.
Well, I think that's what's great about the Princess, ADO71, is that it really advanced the concept with such radical styling and indeed radical underpinnings. And I think it was a really bold attempt to move the game on.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, obviously you've got that Harris Mann styling, which it just looks incredible, doesn't it?
Even today, I think it looks mesmerising.
It's not for everyone, it's not classically beautiful, but it's striking. I think it's really got some presence about it. It's just got something about it. It was supposed to be, of course, even sleeker than this and even sharper, but the E-Series is a tall engine. They weren't going to fit it under a low bonnet. It had to have this raised bulge. You've got, obviously, the outlandish styling, modern engineering underneath. You've got the Hydragas suspension, of course, which, driving along this road, is just glorious.
Well, this particular example, we know, has been recently re-gassed, so the suspension is as good as it should have been when it left the factory.
It feels like nothing else. I mean, nothing short of a Citroen DS feels quite as wafty. It's glorious.
Yeah.
It's incredibly comfortable. But step inside and it immediately takes you back about 10 years. There's nothing in this that says modern, and it's a lovely place to be, but it doesn't feel like the spaceship that it should feel like given the outside.
Yeah, I think that's probably fair. The interior is quite traditional, really, I suppose, but it does work. I love the fact you've got your switch gear over to the right hand side, the radio's high mounted there, so it's good for access. You've got all your heating and vents there, all close to hand.
The ergonomics are lovely.
It's superb. It's no ball of fire, is it? Particularly in this auto mode. It's
definitely not. I mean, we've got a 2.2 litre E-Series here, and let's be clear, she is silky smooth. On idle, we could barely tell it was running. It is smooth, and there is a fair amount of torque there. It will pull itself along, but yeah, the gearbox is the letdown, because it does not. I mean, if I put my foot down now, not much.
Yeah,
really.
You have to book an appointment to get to 60, don't you? It's pretty slow. But I don't know, for me that just makes you drive in a certain way. You're not driving there to get A to B in the quickest possible time. You're there to enjoy the journey.
You just naturally feel like you're sat in an armchair.
Yes.
And it rides like one. It's so peaceful as well. You're not banging over the bumps. It's a relaxing experience, this. And arguably, it blends the old and the new perfectly, because you get the modern styling, you get the then modern E-Series engine, combined with this traditional cabin and this lovely relaxing ride. It's all the good bits of being new with perhaps less of the bad.
There's a real sense of occasion to driving along in something like this, but you're just never going to do it quickly.
No, exactly. Soak it up, enjoy it. But the trouble is, this car didn't have the smoothest introduction to life, certainly not as smooth as its ride, did it? Because, well, there was a factory strike just a month after the car was released,
yes.
So even the people that did want one and did want to buy one couldn't have one.
You launch a car, and that's when you expect demand to be at its peak, and that was the precise moment that supply was at its lowest.
But then when the people who had ordered their car did manage to get one, what you were then greeted with was issues with carburettors and issues with drive shafts breaking up and issues with that fantastic Hydragas leaking and giving it sort of a funny American lowrider stance where it sits on one side.
And unfortunately, yet another example in the British car industry where the initial concept was ultimately let down by poor execution. I think it betrayed the otherwise excellent concept of the car.
This car was going up against some of Europe's best cars, like obviously a high-spec Granada, which was a fine car at the time, and a Citroen CX, which was like a spaceship, even more so than this car, and it needed to be the best that we could throw at it. And unfortunately, through no fault of the cars, but for every fault of its circumstances, it just wasn't going into the battle fully swinging.
Well, the trouble is the 1970s was this tremendously turbulent time for a whole bunch of reasons. It was a time when there was neither the financial resources, the management was at loggerheads with the workforce, the factories were underfunded.
When you're trying to build a world-beating car, you need the best circumstances in which to build it. But poor old British Leyland were struggling to get parts through the front door, and then they were struggling to get cars delivered.
If you look at how this was a radical car, but sort of poorly executed, something like Ford were so good at just saying, okay, we're not going to do anything radical, we're just going to go with tried and tested mechanicals and just do it well at the right price.
You have to admire British Leyland for trying. It might not have worked, but they gave it a go. And you know what? Yes, it was flawed. Yes, it was late to have the O series that it should have done. It took the Princess 2 to get the O series, and yes, it had all these build quality issues, but just driving it in its own right, it's a lovely thing.
Yeah.
When it's working well, it's glorious, it's refined, the visibility is lovely, it's got a nice low waistline, so you've got a nice commanding view of the road ahead, and in the back, I mean, this is practically a limousine. It's a genuinely lovely car to drive this, it's relaxing.
No, absolutely.
And it doesn't feel its age, it doesn't feel nearly 50 years old.
Yeah, it's fabulous.
If they'd given it that hatchback that it looks like it should have, and it's so badly needed, and they'd taken their time to develop it properly, and they hadn't had these strikes that had held back the release, then maybe it could have been an all-time great.
Tantalisingly close, isn't it?
As is so often the way, but it couldn't have a hatchback, unfortunately, because of the other car we're driving today.
Right, Joe, here we are in another childhood hero of mine, the Rover SD1.
Executive luxury in magnificent greens.
It's superb, it's so of its time, isn't it? It wasn't, that's the point.
Well, indeed, because of course, underneath this radical modern David beige styling, designed to look like a Ferrari Daytona, I don't make the rules, but you have to mention that every time you talk about the SD1.
Yep, absolutely.
Underneath this spaceship styling, extremely conventional, quite old school in fact.
Well, I think that's what I quite like about the SD1, is it's very traditional underneath, but first and strut suspension, live rear axle. By then, a very tried and tested 3.5 V8 engine, which is what it came with when it was launched in 1976. But the styling, exterior and interior, were light years ahead of anything else on the market, really quite groundbreaking. The fact that it sold pretty consistently well throughout its 10-year life suggests how sort of futuristic that styling was.
Inside, this immediately feels more modern than the Princess. You've got a more rounded, sculpted dash, you've got a slightly higher waistline. There are some clever bits as well. To keep the costs down for entering between left-hand drive and right-hand drive, all the gauges you can see there are contained in that one little box. And if it's a left-hand drive car, you screw it down on this side. If it's a right-hand drive, you screw it down on that side. And then you just plug the hole for the steering column with a nice little air vent, which keeps your gentleman's region nice and cool on a warm day.
Very practical.
This car had to be simple though, because British Leyland wanted a simple, cheap to produce, high volume selling car. So on the early cars you had drum rear brakes, it's got a live rear axle. It was all designed to make a big car for small money.
British Leyland by then was having to rationalise everything no end. The SD1, Specialist Division 1, of which Rover, Triumph and Jaguar were a part, were trying to sort of rationalise the range. They needed to replace the Triumph 2000 and 2500 and the Rover P6 with one car. Now Triumph and Rover put forward proposals, and it was the Rover P10 proposal, this car, that got the green light, and I'm so glad it did. I just think it's glorious. It's radical in as much as it's a 5-door hatchback. I think it was only Renault offering a hatchback at the time, and it was the only car of its time at the time to offer a V8 engine this side of a Mercedes, which certainly in the UK would have been really rare and really expensive.
Incredibly so. I mean, and also we like being very patriotic, having a British product. This car was decided it would have a hatchback because you look at the design, it suits a hatchback, it needs it, and indeed that makes it an immensely practical car. That came at the expense for the Princess, because they decided no, if it had a hatchback as well, it would cut into sales for the Maxi and the SD1. So the poor old Princess is effectively a saloon, much like the Mini.
I think the Rover got the nod because it was generally perceived to be the more upmarket compared to Triumph, which is ironic because we're now driving a 2600, which is a heavily reworked Triumph engine of the day. I mean, they claimed it was an all-new engine, effectively the Triumph 2500 engine, just thoroughly re-engineered. It's got a lovely character to it. It's very different to the V8. It's got a lovely sporty smoothiness to it, which I really like. And everyone bangs on about the V8, and you can understand why.
The noise,
the V8's got that guttural roar. It's simple and yet it's sort of unburstable. That's the proper fire-breathing example that most people sort of hanker after. But make no mistake, this 2600 is still a fine car. I mean, there were other engines that came out, ultimately the 2-litre O series in 82. They also got the 2.4 VM turbo diesel. Fleet orientated choices for the UK and the European market, so they were quite bold. There was also the Series 2 SD1 in 81.
The Series 1 for me, as we're in today, offers the purity of experience of a Rover SD1 because the whole thing was being pure. You'll notice there's actually minimal stuff on the dash. There's a lot of big wide open space with not much going on, and even things like you'll notice there's no wood in here, keeping it simple. There's not 2 bits of trim, it's all basically the same unless you get to the armrest. Even down to that skeletal Rover badge, it was designed to be a very minimalist experience, but actually in that way, look at most modern cars, look at how few buttons there are in the interior of a modern car. It was very forward thinking.
And they did add wood with the later cars as well, as they tried to perhaps move it a bit more up market, but I actually prefer the sort of minimalist approach.
Motorsport inspired perhaps, because these did have some success on the racetrack, didn't they?
They had success at the British touring cars, and it supposedly did help sales actually. And of course the Vitesse that came out, fuel injection and 190 horsepower, was the sort of fruits of that touring car labour really.
But for as much as we do like the modern styling, we like the modern interior, and clearly racing drivers liked it because it won and the public liked it, it wasn't without its issues, was it? Within months of release on these cars, journalists were reporting all kinds of issues, and not small stuff. The door seals, particularly in the back, you could see daylight through them. Paint flaking off almost immediately when stones chipped it and things like that, and things like wheel wobble at high speeds. All of this on brand new examples of press cars to be tested.
That was hugely disappointing given that they developed a brand new production line at Solihull to build this car. So there wasn't even the excuse of an ageing factory to sort of go back to. But of course, industrial unrest was de rigueur in those mid-70s, and of course that disrupted supply and indeed consistency of build, so that didn't help matters.
And of course, when you've already got the bad reputation for the quality and the reliability early on, much like the Princess and every other Leyland car, it's very hard to shake it. But it's all right. It's okay, because this is back when Leyland were gunning to go to America, remember? So they did send this car to America, the 3500, the V8.
Should have done well.
It should have done very well, but of course you're sending a big V8 rear-wheel drive, simply mechanical car to a market that's already flooded with those. So in total, they sold less than 800. But of course, when you're in a good example like this car we're in today, you can appreciate their good points, starting with the ride.
The ride's great. It feels so solid, actually.
Again, that 6-cylinder engine, it's not the most powerful thing in the world, but it's so smooth, practical. We've got an enormous back seat, even bigger than the Princess, and that hatchback boot is huge. You can get all sorts of clobber back there, which of course one of this car's favourite customers would have done, and that was the police. Because they were tough, they could take a bit of a beating, they handled well, and they were fast in V8 guys, obviously, perfect crime fighting mobile, and they were cool as well, because on telly they were in the new Avengers, they were in the Professionals. The SD1 was a cool car, and arguably today, it's cooler now than it ever has been.
Yeah, no, I really like them.
Both of them are gloriously out there and wild and different, and they tried something new, but as a result, they both had their problems.
Well, what's really interesting actually, I looked at the production numbers for both cars, and if you include the ambassador numbers in the Princess, they're actually only around 20,000 apart. They really were quite similar. The problem is, in comparison to, say, Ford, they were nowhere.
At the time, your typical British buyer was still quite conservative, and they were perhaps frightened off by radical styling and the unusual engineering, and what made the Princess and the SD1 so special was potentially their downfall. But I am very glad that enough people at British Leyland back in the day gave these two glorious wedges the green light, because what we've ended up with is two fantastic cars and two brilliant British classics today.
Two great examples of cars that came out of British Leyland in those troubled era of the 1970s that belied all expectations. They sort of pushed the game forward in terms of design and engineering. I guess I've got to ask, which one would you want to take home with you?
It's a really difficult one, because I like the old school charms of the SD1, but I like how well the Princess all comes together and how it wears its radicalness, if that's a word, on its sleeve. And by a hair, my vote goes to the Princess.
Personally, I'd like both of them on my drive, but I think I would, at a whisker, take the Princess as well. I would clearly just take both. I think they're just such excellent cars, excellent concepts. You'd let us know in the comments which one you take, because it's such a finely balanced decision, I think. There's no right or wrong with this at all, but which would you have, the Princess or the SD1?
This video is proudly sponsored by Lancaster Insurance. Give them a call on 01480 400 889 for an insurance quote on your classic car. And don't forget to click the link below to enter their latest competition.